Today's lecture for HS 200 is on ecofeminism. It is based on the assigned reading, which is titled The Power and the Promise of Ecofeminism Revisited by Karen Warren. So the lecture is based on this reading. Ecofeminist philosophy is an approach to environmental philosophy, and this is what we are going to discuss in today's lecture. Ecofeminist philosophy combines elements of three different things. It combines elements of feminism as a theoretical lens, and it also combines elements of an environmental or an ecological perspective. And at the end of the day, it is a kind of philosophical framework. And ecofeminists argue that ecofeminist philosophy as a conceptual lens, as a philosophical lens, will help us to understand what to aim for in one's understanding and solution to both environmental issues and gender issues, and often issues that actually have an element of sort of invoke issues of gender as well as the environment. So one way to think about it is to consider a couple of scenarios that are shown on the slide. Author also talks about some of these scenarios. So for instance, think of a situation where there's, let's say, dumping of waste or a first world development project, and that has particular implications for maternal and child health in developing economies where such waste is dumped. So in this kind of scenario, you will see that there are concerns about gender that are central, and which also kind of, and there are concerns about the environment, and you cannot really sort of take these two apart. You need to consider both of these together if we are to develop an ethical lens to look at this situation. In other words, if we are to understand what our responsibility is, or what the responsibility of a policy is towards this kind of a situation, and if we are to in fact either analyze or solve this kind of a situation. So an ecofeminist perspective would be extremely helpful in both sort of talking about these situations, analyzing them, as well as solving them, and talking about ethical decision making in these contexts. So as I said, ecofeminist philosophy involves three different elements. It involves elements from the theoretical lens of feminism, it involves aspects of environmental philosophy, and it involves, of course, it is embedded in the discipline of philosophy. So let me explain these three things briefly for you to understand what this theoretical lens entails. So feminism as a theoretical position uses gender, or takes gender to be a starting point or a very central point of analyzing and critiquing systems of domination that we see around us, right? So gender is taken to be an analytical category in a feminist lens, and ecofeminists also do the same. As an environmental position, ecofeminism uses insights from environmental philosophy about the non-human world or nature, and theorizing human interactions in the context of this kind of environmental lens. Therefore, it is an ecofeminist lens. Finally, it is a kind of philosophical position because as philosophers, we are interested in conceptual analysis, right? Not empirical analysis, but conceptual analysis, where you're looking at different concepts operative in this kind of theoretical lens, and you are interested, your method is by providing argumentative justification. Therefore, ecofeminist philosophy has elements of feminism, environmental and ecological position, as well as philosophy. Ecofeminist philosophy, it actually takes a lot from feminism in centering the question of the other, or groups of people that are othered, right? So whenever we talk about domination or oppression, these sort of phenomena in the social world, it is often perpetuated by one group towards another, right? So the group that is marginalized, that is exploited, that is dominated, is considered to be considered to be the other in this context. So ecofeminist philosophy focuses on analyzing and providing solution for the unjustified domination of those considered to be other. So and here in the ecofeminist context, there are two kinds of others that are considered. So human others, right? So for instance, ecofeminists argue that in the context of patriarchy, women are othered, right? In the context of white, in the context of racism, non-white people are othered, right? And in the same way, ecofeminists also argue that when we center the human being as the master of the universe in a fashion, and everything, we make everything to be about the human being, then there are also non-human beings are othered in that sort of anthropocentric paradigm. So you have earth others, right, like animals, forests, etc., who are sort of occupy a marginalized secondary position in this sort of more anthropocentric worldview. So one of the main premises of ecofeminist philosophy is that the domination of others, whether it's human others or non-human others, by the dominant group or dominant culture, is not inevitable. In other words, this can be prevented, and neither is this domination justified. So we will see a little bit in the next few slides how they talk about this form of domination. But their main point is that this sort of this sort of domination others in the happens in the context of othering, and neither is this domination inevitable nor is it justified. So ecofeminist philosophers such as Val Plumwood and Karen Warren bring insights from feminist philosophy to bear on our relation to the non-human world. And therefore they find feminist philosophy to be very useful to talk about or to offer a broader theory of domination, right? Because feminist philosophers actually in considering gender and the centrality of gender have developed very sophisticated frameworks to think about the whole phenomena of domination, oppression, and so on and so forth. So ecofeminist philosophers find this to be very helpful when they talk about environmental concerns or concerns at the intersection of gender and environment. One of the very central claims on which today's lecture will focus on is the idea that ecofeminist philosophers offer, or one of the central claims that they make, that there are important connections between the unjustified domination of women and the domination of non-human world or nature within patriarchy. In other words, patriarchal systems not only sort of uphold the domination of women, but they at the same time also exploit nature, or they have a kind of exploitative relationship with nature in the same way. So so they say that these two forms of domination, how historically, for instance, sexism has worked, or domination of women have worked within patriarchy, intersects with the domination of nature. And understanding of this connection is critical to both environmental ethics and feminism, they say. In other words, environmental ethics needs to therefore also consider the centrality of gender in their analysis, because the domination of women and domination of nature exhibits certain similarities and continuities, and feminism, on the other hand, also needs to attend to environmental issues because of this connection. Now, we are going to look at how they say this sort of historical, a kind of domination which has happened, how these two are connected. And as you will see on the slide, I have put two different columns. In one column, you'll see the heading is women, and the other it's men. And you will see things such as culture, mind, reason that have been historically associated with men, whereas things like nature, body, emotion, which has been historically assigned to women. In other words, whether you look at art, literature, philosophy, historically and conceptually, women have been considered to be very close to nature. Women have been reduced to their bodies. They have been considered to be emotional beings. In contrast, men have been considered to be associated with mind, with reason, so on and so forth, with culture. So what has happened within patriarchy, feminists have argued, is that there's a binary, gender binary that is created. Patriarchy operates through a gender binary of men and women as being two different sort of categories, right? Two different groups who do not share any characteristics among themselves. So it's a binary. That is why it's a binary. It's a dichotomy where there are two different categories that don't intersect, and each category has certain essential features that the other doesn't share. And what has happened is that women have been considered to be exhibiting or be closer to nature, body, emotion, whereas men have been considered to be associated with culture, mind, reason. So what this has resulted in is two things. Interestingly, that feminist philosophers have pointed out, that often nature is looked at through a kind of, there's a feminization of nature that happens, okay? And she is exploited. And there's a naturalization of women, where women are considered to be sort of products of nature or closer to nature than men are. Men reside in the domain of freedom, women reside in the domain of necessity. This is how associations within patriarchy have been made in art, literature, and philosophy. And what this has done is that once this sort of very different kinds of features are attributed to these two groups on two sides of the binary, this has then been used to justify the subordination of both women and nature, because you'll see that women and nature are on the same side of the binary, and they are the other in the context of patriarchy, which privileges male and the masculine viewpoint. Okay, so this hopefully this chart will help you to understand the kind of association that ecofeminist philosophers are talking about. So the connection that they're making is that with patriarchy basically perpetuates the othering of both women and nature, right? Secondly, that patriarchy is there's an underlying philosophical or conceptual framework to patriarchy, right? So there's the social aspects of patriarchy, but there's a certain logic, there's a certain philosophical framework based on which patriarchy operates, right? And ecofeminists basically try to outline, ecofeminist philosophers particularly try to outline this kind of conceptual framework underlying patriarchy, which has justified the domination of both women and non-human nature. And in this kind of, and what they argue is that, as I have already mentioned, that within patriarchy, both women and nature are othered in a manner, and whoever is considered to be the other is excluded, marginalized, exploited, devalued, or naturalized in a domination subordination relationship. So let's now take a step back to try to understand what ecofeminist philosophers mean by an oppressive conceptual framework. In other words, what is the definition of oppressive conceptual framework and what are its features? So the ecofeminist philosophers argue that an oppressive conceptual framework underlies all forms of domination or oppression. What is a conceptual framework? A conceptual framework is basically a set of beliefs, attitudes, values, and assumptions that we hold and which shape our worldview, which actually, mediates or based on which we interact with the world. So it's almost like a filter, right? Think of, if you're wearing a blue colored glass, then the whole world will appear to be blue through that glass, right? So conceptual framework is a framework which is at the level of your concepts that you hold. So basically what, when we approach the world, when we understand the world, when we interact with the world, we do so based on certain beliefs, certain attitudes, certain values we hold. And certain assumptions we have about the world. So a conceptual framework includes these aspects, and philosophers are actually interested in looking at these sort of conceptual frameworks. So now that we know what a conceptual framework is, what is an oppressive conceptual framework? So an oppressive conceptual framework is one that actually maintains, explains, and justifies domination of some kind, right? So oppressive conceptual framework will be those sorts of beliefs, attitudes, values, and assumptions that are geared towards explaining, maintaining, and justifying forms of domination. So patriarchy will be this kind of a oppressive conceptual framework. So in patriarchy particularly, this is focused on justifying the subordination of women by men and creating gender-based inequalities. And ecofeminists are going to argue here, not only are women subordinated, but nature is as well. Why? Because as we saw in the previous slide, that women and nature have been very closely linked within this kind of framework. Now, going on to again, what are the features of an oppressive conceptual framework? So there are several features that ecofeminist philosophers are talking about. First of all, this sort of conceptual framework divides the world into binaries. We saw when we were talking, giving the example of patriarchy in one of the earlier slides, and I had the chart, you saw that it operates through this kind of binary, that there are men and there are women, right? And there are no overlapping features. They're just completely two different groups who do not share anything in common. And these categories are completely exclusive to each other. We'll come to the point about exclusive in the next slide, but it means that there are no overlapping features, right? These are mutually exclusive and they're jointly exhaustive, meaning that gender within patriarchy can only be thought through a binary, right? That is what patriarchy imposes on us. The gender is only in a binary. So there are only two categories, and those two categories, men and women, are exhaustive of what gender is. So this is the definition of a binary, when categories are mutually exclusive and jointly exhaustive. An oppressive conceptual framework, ecofeminist philosophers argue, also exhibits a kind of value hierarchy, by which they mean it exhibits a kind of up-down thinking. So if the two categories, let's say X and Y, right, this is the binary that this framework upholds. In this case, if X is man and Y is woman in a patriarchal kind framework, as the example, X will be considered to have greater value than Y within this kind of framework, right? So X is attributed more value than Y. So therefore, X and Y in this kind of framework are not only different from each other, but one is more valued than the other. right? So there is, now you can see that there is an emergence of inferiority, attribution of inferiority and superiority to the difference between X and Y. So X and Y are not just different, but one is more valued and one is less valued. This is what is called up-down thinking or value hierarchical thinking. So kind of to elaborate more on this, ecofeminist philosophers are saying that this framework exhibits oppositional value dualisms. So let us break this down. Value dualisms, why? Because there are these two different categories which have different values, right? One is better, considered to be better than the other, or higher in value than the other. So X is more valuable than Y, right? So it's a kind of value dualism, and they are in opposition to each other because, as I already said, that these two categories are considered to be mutually exclusive. They are disjunctive pairs, if we use terms from logic. That is, they're exclusive. Their features of one cannot be shared with the other, and they are jointly exhaustive. They are oppositional because one, X and Y are in opposition to each other, and one is more valued than the other. So an oppressive conceptual framework like patriarchy also exhibits value dualisms, oppositional value dualisms, ecofeminist philosophers say. So for example, they say that historically male, white, and culture have been privileged over, let's say, female, non-white, and nature in patriarchal frameworks. The next feature of an oppressive conceptual framework is that it has a particular understanding of power. And as I said, see, as philosophers are really interested in understanding concepts. So here they're saying that the concept of power is understood in a very peculiar, narrow way within an oppressive conceptual framework. Power is only understood in a top-down way, meaning that power operates through domination, power operates to control. There is no other understanding of power in this framework. So it's a top-down model. Power is something that's imposed from top on some group that is considered to be valued less, right? So power is understood as justified power of the ups over whoever is considered to be down. Okay, so in this case, since X was more valued than Y, power is understood as justified power of X over Y. And what does this notion of power do? It actually helps to keeps both the dominant status of the ups intact, meaning that it justifies the fact that ups are dominating over the downs, right? So it keeps the power of X intact and privilege of X intact, and it subordinates the downs, saying that, oh, you are valued less, so you are inferior, you can only be dominated upon, you cannot have power. Okay, so this notion of power as in a top-down model creates and maintains practices of this sort of stratification or this sort of division, and it advantages the ups over the downs. So in this case, X in the patriarchal framework, it privileges men over both women and nature. This is how the argument is going. A final feature of an oppressive conceptual framework is that an oppressive conceptual framework sanctions or upholds what philosophers call a logic of domination. It is a certain logical kind of view of the world that these frameworks uphold. It is a logical structure of argumentation that both explains and justifies this unjustified domination that we have shown in an oppressive conceptual framework, right? The unjustified domination where X is being attributed more value than Y and X is dominating over Y. So basically, how does this logic of domination work? Typically, it works by conceptualizing the ups, that is X, to have some feature. So in this case, for instance, X equal to man, and man is considered to be having certain features like rationality, moral ability, so on and so forth, and which the downs, which is Y, and in this case, both women and non-human nature actually lack. So Ys are understood as lacking what X possesses. So therefore Ys are considered to be inferior to X, because these are considered to be superior qualities that X has, and since the downs of the Y does not have these characteristics, Y is considered to be inferior in this chain. So on the basis of this assumed superiority of X over Y, there's another step that happens, and another step is that then an oppressive conceptual framework goes on to show that not only are X and Y different, but X is justified in dominating Y because X is superior to Y. So you see what has happened, that there is, even if there is some difference between X and Y, this difference has now been considered to be in a binary. It has been considered to be of differential value because of the value hierarchical thinking. It is considered to be oppositional, right? And therefore, this difference has been turned into a form of domination of X over Y, right? So now, on the basis of this assumed superiority of X over Y, the domination of Y by X is justified, being justified within an oppressive conceptual framework. Okay, so I have basically outlined the different features, right, of a philosophical of a I mean, I have outlined the features of a conceptual or a philosophical paradigm framework, which is an oppressive conceptual framework. And now when you apply it to patriarchy, you see, by putting men, X equal to men and Y equal to women in nature, you can see these different features actually showing up within an oppressive conceptual framework such as patriarchy. So ecofeminist philosophers will, now that they have laid out the different aspects of an oppressive conceptual framework and all these features of it, including this logic of domination, they will say that, in order for us to have a more egalitarian, a more sort of sophisticated and really viable approach to environmental philosophy, we need to reject the logic of domination. They will reject that difference in itself justifies domination. Things can be different, but that doesn't mean that one group is justified in dominating over the other, right? So this is the whole discussion of oppressive conceptual framework. Actually, through that, we discussed how something which is very innocent, some kind of difference, might then be used and manipulated to justify domination. So ecofeminist philosophers reject that difference in itself justifies domination. Also, they are going to argue that if there are some relevant differences that may make some groups superior to other in some aspects, and the philosopher that you read, the article that you read actually gives a very interesting example where they're saying that, well, race car drivers might be better drivers than ordinary drivers, but then do we go on to say that this justifies that race car drivers are going to now dominate over all other drivers that are not race car drivers? Clearly, this is not justified, right? So therefore, difference is not in itself does not in itself justify domination. It is only an oppressive conceptual framework that is taking this difference and really sort of transforming it into a tool for domination. So at the end of the day, ecofeminist philosophers are going to they basically say that that feminization of nature and naturalization of women are both related within patriarchy. Both women and non-human nature have been devalued as compared to men and male-centric values such as rationality, and therefore within these systems of domination, both women and non-human nature suffer. This subordination is neither inevitable nor is it justified. This only happens because of the operation of a logic of domination. And therefore, given this analysis, they argue that environmental ethics, which is concerned with eliminating the unjustified domination of non-human nature, and feminism, which is concerned with eliminating sexism, should actually join forces, and both perspectives ought to incorporate ecofeminist insights into their analysis and practices to solve real world problems. So with this, we end the lecture on ecofeminism. Thank you.